On the morning of May 29, 1944, 40 German soldiers died in approximately 90 seconds on a hillside in central Italy. They were killed by one American officer firing a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on an open-top tank destroyer. The officer was Captain William Wy Galt, and within minutes of achieving what 3 infantry assaults had failed to accomplish, he was dead. The question is not whether his action was brave. The question is whether any amount of courage justifies what happened in that trench, and whether the men who ordered the next assault understood what they were asking. The Italian peninsula in the spring of 1944 was not a theater of swift advances and dramatic breakthroughs. It was a terrain of accumulation, where small hills acquired tactical significance and men died for elevations that offered nothing but a view of the next ridge. The Gustav Line had fallen. The Hitler Line had cracked. Now the Allies faced the Caesar Line, a German defensive network anchored in the Alban Hills south of Rome. The line was neither as heavily fortified as Monte Cassino nor as celebrated in the histories, but it was effective in the way that all good defensive positions are effective. It made attack expensive. Hill 209 near Villa Crocetta was one node in this system. It was not a mountain. It was a rise in the ground, notable only because it dominated the approaches to the village and the roads beyond. The Germans had dug in along its crest with the methodical competence that characterized their defensive engineering throughout the Italian campaign. The position consisted of a zigzag trench system, each angle calculated to provide mutual support and to deny attackers any extended line of fire. Machine gun positions were sited to cover the slopes. Dugouts were reinforced against artillery. The men holding the position were not elite troops, but they understood their work and they had been doing it for months. The 34th Infantry Division had been in Italy since the Salerno landings. By May 1944, the division had fought its way through the mud and mountains of the Apennines, had taken casualties at San Pietro and Cassino, and had learned the particular exhaustion of attacking uphill into prepared defenses. The men were experienced. They knew what worked and what did not. What did not work, in most cases, was frontal assault against entrenched machine guns, but that knowledge did not change the necessity of taking ground. On the morning of May 29th, the division attacked Hill 209. The assault was preceded by artillery preparation, the standard procedure intended to suppress or destroy defensive positions before infantry closed with the objective. The guns fired on schedule. The shells impacted along the ridge. When the barrage lifted, the infantry advanced. They reached the base of the hill, began the climb, and encountered fire from positions that had not been suppressed. The attack faltered. Men went to ground, returned fire, called for support, and eventually withdrew. The position remained in German hands. A second assault was ordered. The artillery fired again, longer this time, with greater concentration on the known machine gun positions. The infantry moved forward. The result was nearly identical. The Germans had constructed their positions with overhead cover sufficient to protect against all but direct hits. The men inside waited out the bombardment, returned to their weapons when it ceased, and engaged the attackers as they came into range. The Americans took casualties and fell back. A third assault achieved the same outcome. By midday, the tactical problem was clear. The artillery, firing from positions several kilometers to the rear, could not reliably destroy dugouts and reinforced emplacements. The machine guns, particularly the German MG-42 with its sustained rate of fire exceeding 1,000 rounds per minute, commanded the approaches. Infantry advancing across open ground could not reach the trench line without prohibitive losses. The position had to be taken, but the method for taking it was not apparent. Captain William Wy Galt was not leading any of these assaults. He was the Battalion S3 officer, responsible for operations and planning, a staff position that placed him at the command post rather than at the front. He was 32 years old, a rancher from Montana, a man whose adult life before the war had been spent managing livestock and land in a landscape that required constant attention to terrain and movement. He had joined the division early, had served through North Africa and Sicily, and had developed a reputation for competence and for a particular understanding of how ground and geometry shaped tactical outcomes. Galt watched the third assault fail and began to consider alternatives. The problem was not a lack of firepower. The division had artillery, mortars, and supporting arms in abundance. The problem was that none of these systems could deliver fire directly into the trench at the angle necessary to kill men sheltered behind earthen walls. Artillery struck from above but rarely achieved the vertical precision required to drop shells into a narrow trench. Mortars were more effective but still dependent on trajectory and timing. What was needed was a weapon that could fire horizontally along the length of the trench, or better, straight down into it, at a range close enough to guarantee hits. Tank destroyers were not designed for this role. The M10, known officially as the 3-inch gun motor carriage, was a mobile anti-tank platform built on a modified Sherman chassis. It carried a 3-inch main gun capable of penetrating German armor at standard engagement ranges, and it mounted a 50 caliber machine gun on a pintle at the rear of the turret for use against aircraft or soft targets. The turret was open-topped, a design choice that reduced weight and improved ventilation, but left the crew exposed to plunging fire and fragments. The vehicle was intended to fight at distance, to maneuver, engage, and withdraw. It was not intended to approach fortified infantry positions at close range. Galt requested the use of M10s in direct support of the next assault. The request was approved. The plan was straightforward. The tank destroyers would advance to positions where they could bring their main guns to bear on the German trench system, providing suppressive fire while infantry closed the distance. It was a reasonable use of available assets, conventional in concept, and unlikely to succeed for the same reasons the artillery had not succeeded. The 3-inch gun could destroy a bunker if it scored a direct hit, but hitting a trench from several hundred meters was a matter of chance, and the Germans would return fire the moment the M10s revealed their positions. Galt understood this. He also understood something else, something derived not from military doctrine but from years of working with animals in confined spaces. Livestock in a pen or a chute could be controlled by limiting their avenues of movement. A cow moving down a narrow passage could not turn around or escape laterally, could only move forward or backward, and its behavior became predictable. The same principle applied to men in a trench. A trench was a linear space, engineered to allow movement along its length but not across its width. Men inside it could advance or retreat along the trench line, but they could not easily exit under fire. If a weapon could be positioned to fire directly down the length of the trench, the men inside would have no room to maneuver and no cover from that angle of attack. The difficulty was positioning such a weapon. Infantry could not approach close enough without being killed. Artillery could not achieve the required angle. A tank destroyer, however, could move across terrain that infantry could not cross, and if it reached a position above and adjacent to the trench, the 50 caliber machine gun mounted on the turret could be depressed to fire straight down. The machine gun was not the primary armament, but at close range, firing into a confined space, it did not need to be. The 50 caliber round was effective against light armor and devastating against unprotected personnel. At a rate of fire exceeding 500 rounds per minute, it could sweep a trench in seconds. The plan required the M10 to close to within meters of the German position. It required precise navigation across broken ground under observation and fire. It required someone to man the 50 caliber, exposed in the open turret, while the vehicle maneuvered. Galt decided to ride the M10 himself. This decision was not required by his position. Staff officers did not typically accompany tank destroyers into assault. Galt could have briefed the crew, coordinated from the command post, and observed the results. He chose instead to be present, to control the machine gun, and to direct the vehicle's movements in real time. The reasons for this choice are not fully documented. It is possible he believed the tactic would fail without direct supervision. It is possible he felt responsible for the men who would execute the plan. It is also possible he simply understood that asking others to do something he would not do himself was incompatible with the kind of officer he believed he should be. The M10 moved forward in the early afternoon. The driver navigated the vehicle upslope, using folds in the ground to minimize exposure. Galt stood in the open turret, scanning the trench line, identifying the angles and distances. The Germans saw the tank destroyer and opened fire. Small arms rounds struck the hull and turret. The vehicle continued to advance. The crew inside could hear the impacts but could not see the source. Galt, exposed above, could see everything. The geometry of the position became clear as the M10 approached. The German trench zigzagged along the crest of the hill, each section angled to prevent enfilade fire from the flanks. The defenders had dug connecting trenches and dugouts, creating a network that allowed movement between positions without exposure. The machine gun nests were sited at the angles, covering the approaches. From the front, the position was nearly impregnable. From above, it was a series of linear spaces with no overhead protection. Galt directed the driver to maneuver the M10 to a point where the vehicle's position blocked the main exits from the trench. This was the critical insight, the application of livestock management to human combat. If the trench occupants could not exit, they could not retreat or reposition. They would be confined to the trench line, and the .50 caliber could traverse along that line with methodical precision. The M10 reached the position. Galt swung the machine gun into alignment and opened fire. What happened in the next 90 seconds is difficult to describe without descending into voyeurism or melodrama. The facts are sufficient. The .50 caliber machine gun fired approximately 450 rounds. The rounds entered the trench from above at an angle that eliminated cover. The trench was approximately 1.2 meters wide and 1.8 meters deep, dimensions that provided excellent protection against frontal fire but none against plunging fire. The men inside had no room to maneuver and no ability to return effective fire against a target directly above them. Some attempted to climb out of the trench and were hit while exposed. Others pressed against the trench walls and were hit by rounds that ricocheted or fragmented. A few reached the dugouts and survived. Most did not. The number killed is estimated at 40. This figure comes from post-war assessments and unit records, not from any count conducted in the immediate aftermath. The German unit holding the position was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Those who survived either fled or surrendered. The trench, which had withstood 3 infantry assaults and sustained artillery bombardment, was taken. Galt ceased fire when there was no movement in the trench. The M10 had accomplished its objective. The infantry, which had been waiting for the signal to advance, moved forward and occupied the position. The tactical problem that had consumed the morning had been solved. The cost was 40 German lives and 90 seconds of machine gun fire. What remained was the question of whether this outcome represented tactical brilliance or simply the mechanical application of overwhelming force against trapped men. The answer came quickly. The Germans had not abandoned the sector. They had withdrawn to secondary positions and were already preparing a counterattack. German doctrine emphasized immediate counteraction to any penetration of the line. The units defending Hill 209 had been mauled, but reserves were available, and artillery support could be coordinated. Within minutes of the American occupation of the trench, German guns began to range in on the position. The M10 was still on the hill. The vehicle had not withdrawn after the assault. Galt remained in the turret. It is unclear whether he intended to provide continued support, to observe the consolidation of the position, or whether he simply had not finished his assessment of the terrain. What is clear is that the M10 was stationary, exposed, and identifiable as a priority target. The first German shells landed short. The second salvo bracketed the position. Bracketing is a technique in which artillery fires rounds on either side of a target to establish range, then adjusts to hit the target directly. The third salvo was on target. One shell penetrated the open turret of the M10. The effect of a high-explosive shell detonating inside an armored vehicle is catastrophic. The blast is contained by the armor, amplifying the overpressure and fragmentation. The crew inside has no chance of survival. Galt, standing in the turret, was killed instantly. The vehicle was destroyed. The infantry in the trench, now without close support, came under sustained counterattack. The position on Hill 209 changed hands twice more before the day ended. The Americans ultimately held the ground, but the tactical advantage gained by Galt's action was temporary. The breakthrough did not lead to a collapse of the Caesar line. The Germans withdrew in good order, established new positions, and continued to resist. Rome fell 5 days later, not because of Hill 209, but because the broader weight of the Allied offensive made continued defense of the capital untenable. In the larger narrative of the Italian campaign, Hill 209 was a minor action, barely noted in divisional histories. For the men who participated, however, the action was anything but minor. The soldiers who had watched 3 assaults fail, and then witnessed a single tank destroyer accomplish what they could not, were left with a complicated understanding of warfare. Violence in war is often diffuse, the result of long-range fire or aerial bombardment, where the act of killing is separated from the sight of death. What Galt did was different. It was close, visible, and absolute. The men in that trench had no chance once the .50 caliber opened fire. They were not defeated by superior tactics or overwhelming numbers. They were trapped and killed with mechanical efficiency. This raises a question that military histories often avoid. There is a tendency to describe successful actions as examples of courage, innovation, or tactical genius. These descriptions are accurate to a point, but they obscure the reality of what happens when one group of men finds a way to kill another group of men who cannot fight back. The Germans in the trench were not cowards. They had held their position against repeated assaults. They had done their duty as they understood it. They died because someone identified a flaw in the geometry of their defenses and exploited it with a weapon they could not counter. There is no honor in that death, no moment of heroism, just the sudden termination of life in a space designed to protect them. Galt's action was tactically sound. It solved a problem that conventional methods had failed to solve. It minimized American casualties and achieved the immediate objective. From a purely operational standpoint, it was a success. But success in war is measured in contradictions. The same action that saved American lives by avoiding another frontal assault also demonstrated a capacity for killing that exceeded anything the soldiers present had witnessed. The efficiency of the method was its horror. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor came quickly. The award citation emphasized Galt's voluntary exposure to enemy fire, his leadership, and his selfless sacrifice. It noted that his actions enabled the capture of a key position and contributed to the success of the division's operations. These statements are factually accurate. They are also incomplete. The medal recognizes bravery, and Galt was undoubtedly brave. But the medal does not address the question of what bravery means when it is expressed through the application of overwhelming violence against men who have no ability to respond. Galt's family received the medal in a ceremony some months after his death. His wife was present. His children, too young to understand, were told that their father had died a hero. This is what families are told, and it is not untrue. But it is also not the entire story. Galt died because he made a choice to place himself in a position of extreme danger in order to accomplish a mission that would otherwise have failed. That choice reflects a particular kind of courage. It also reflects the brutal logic of war, which demands that some men accept certain death in order to achieve objectives that may or may not matter in the larger course of events. The tactical method Galt employed did not end with him. The use of tank destroyers and tanks in close support of infantry, particularly in situations where conventional fire support was ineffective, became more common in the later stages of the Italian campaign and in the fighting in Northwest Europe. Doctrine evolved to incorporate lessons learned from actions like Hill 209. Training emphasized the importance of combined arms coordination and the need for flexibility in the application of firepower. In this sense, Galt's death contributed to a body of knowledge that saved lives later in the war. But doctrine is a cold thing. It reduces individual actions to principles and methods, stripping away the specific circumstances and the specific men who died. Hill 209 is now a footnote in divisional histories, a brief mention in accounts of the advance on Rome. The trench is gone, filled in decades ago or eroded by weather. The men who died there, German and American, are names on casualty lists if they are remembered at all. There is a photograph of Galt, taken before the war, in which he stands in front of a barn in Montana. He is wearing work clothes, his posture relaxed, his expression calm. It is the photograph of a man at ease in his environment, someone who understands the land and his place in it. That man became a soldier, learned the skills of his profession, and applied them with fatal competence on a hillside in Italy. The distance between those two images, the rancher and the officer firing a machine gun into a trench, is the distance war creates between who we are and what we do. The men in the trench had similar photographs, taken in Germany or Austria or wherever they came from. They had families and work and lives that made sense before the war. They ended up on Hill 209 because the logic of the war put them there, and the logic of the war killed them. There is no equivalence in this observation. The Germans were fighting for a regime that embodied systematic atrocity. The Americans were fighting to end that regime. The moral distinction is clear. But the men in the trench were not abstractions. They were individuals, and they died in a manner that gave them no opportunity for resistance or dignity. Galt understood this. It is impossible to know what he thought in the moments before he opened fire, but it is reasonable to assume he understood exactly what was about to happen. He had positioned the M10 with precision. He had identified the geometry of the trap. He knew the effect of the .50 caliber at close range. He was not acting in the heat of combat or under the pressure of immediate threat. He had time to consider his actions, and he proceeded anyway. This is not a criticism. It is an observation about the nature of command and the burden of decision. Galt chose to kill those men because not killing them meant more Americans would die in another assault. That is the arithmetic of war, and it is inescapable. The counterattack that killed Galt was not random. The Germans saw the M10, understood its significance, and directed fire accordingly. Galt's death was the predictable consequence of remaining in an exposed position after accomplishing the mission. It is possible he did not realize the immediacy of the threat. It is also possible he did realize it and accepted the risk as the cost of ensuring the position was secure. Either way, the outcome was the same. The shell that killed him ended one of the more unusual tactical innovations of the Italian campaign and removed from the battlefield an officer whose understanding of terrain and geometry might have contributed further to the division's effectiveness. The men who knew Galt spoke of him with respect. He was described as competent, calm, and willing to share the risks he asked others to take. These are the qualities of a good officer. They do not, however, explain the specific decision to ride the M10 into assault. That decision remains somewhat opaque, a product of personality, circumstance, and the particular pressures of that day. What is clear is that the decision was consistent with Galt's character as understood by those who served with him. He was not a man who delegated risk when he could assume it himself. The question of whether his death was necessary is unanswerable. The position on Hill 209 would likely have been taken eventually, with or without Galt's intervention. The broader advance on Rome was not dependent on this single action. But necessity in war is a flexible concept. Every action that saves lives in the immediate moment is necessary from the perspective of those lives saved. Every death is unnecessary from the perspective of those who mourn. Galt's death mattered to the men who knew him and to the family he left behind. Its significance to the war effort was marginal. This is true of most deaths in war, which occur in actions that are tactically relevant but strategically inconsequential. The Medal of Honor citation describes Galt as having voluntarily exposed himself to intense enemy fire and having displayed extraordinary heroism. These phrases are accurate but insufficient. They capture the fact of his actions but not their meaning. What Galt did on Hill 209 was not simply brave. It was the application of insight and skill to a problem that had already killed and would have killed more. It was a demonstration that war rewards not just courage but understanding, the ability to see the battlefield as a system of angles and spaces and vulnerabilities. It was also a demonstration that such understanding is lethal, that the ability to kill efficiently is a valued skill in war, and that those who possess that skill often die employing it. There is no clean lesson to extract from this story. War does not offer clean lessons. It offers outcomes, and the outcomes are evaluated according to the objectives at hand. Hill 209 was taken. The advance continued. Rome fell. The war in Italy ground on for another year. Galt's contribution to these outcomes was real but limited. He solved one problem on one day and then he died. This is the arc of most military careers, compressed or extended depending on chance and circumstance. Some men survive their moments of decision. Galt did not. The memorial to Galt, such as it exists, is scattered across official records, family memory, and the occasional mention in histories of the 34th Division. There is no monument on Hill 209. The ground has returned to agriculture or pasture, the contours of the landscape softened by decades of weather and cultivation. The trench is gone. The men who died in it are buried in military cemeteries in Italy or Germany, their graves marked with uniform stone markers that give name, rank, and date of death. Galt is buried in Montana, returned home after the war, his grave marked with the same information and the notation that he received the Medal of Honor. What remains is the story, and the story is incomplete. We know what Galt did. We do not know what he thought. We know the outcome. We do not know whether he believed the outcome justified the method. These gaps are inherent to military history, which relies on after-action reports and official citations, documents that describe events but rarely capture the interior life of the participants. Galt left no diary, no letters describing his thoughts on Hill 209. What we have is the action itself, recorded in the observations of others and the physical evidence of what occurred. The evidence is stark. 40 men died in 90 seconds. 1 man died minutes later. The position changed hands and the war continued. These are the facts, and they permit multiple interpretations. One interpretation is that Galt was a hero who sacrificed himself to save his men. Another is that he was a skilled officer who identified a tactical opportunity and exploited it, accepting the risks inherent in such action. A third is that he was a man caught in a situation where all available choices were terrible, and he chose the one that seemed least terrible at the time. All of these interpretations are defensible. None is complete. What is certain is that war creates situations where ordinary men are required to make decisions that result in death, theirs or others, and that these decisions are evaluated not on their moral content but on their tactical effectiveness. Galt's decision was tactically effective. It achieved the objective at minimal cost to American forces. It also demonstrated a capacity for violence that disturbed some of those who witnessed it. Both things can be true. War does not require consistency. It requires results. The final question, the one posed at the beginning, is whether any amount of courage justifies what happened in that trench. The answer depends on the framework used to evaluate the question. From a military perspective, the action was justified because it succeeded and because it minimized friendly casualties. From a moral perspective, the action was troubling because it involved the systematic killing of men who had no ability to defend themselves. From a historical perspective, the action was typical of a particular kind of warfare, where technological and tactical advantages are exploited to their fullest extent regardless of the immediate human cost. Galt did not live to grapple with these questions. He died doing his duty as he understood it. The men in the trench died doing theirs. The only difference is that we remember one of these deaths as heroic and the others as statistical. This asymmetry is not fair, but fairness is not a concept that survives contact with war. What survives is memory, selective and shaped by the needs of the present. We remember Galt because his story offers something we want to believe about courage and sacrifice. We forget the men in the trench because their story offers nothing but the reminder that war kills indiscriminately and that the manner of death is often arbitrary. Hill 209 is quiet now. The slope is gentle, the vegetation thick, the scars of war erased by time and weather. Nothing marks the location of the trench or indicates that anything significant happened there. This is as it should be. Battlefields are not sacred ground. They are places where terrible things occurred, and once those things are over, the land returns to its ordinary functions. The people who live near Hill 209 now, if any do, have no knowledge of what happened there in 1944. Their lives are connected to the present, not to a past that ended before most of them were born. But the past does not disappear simply because it is forgotten. It persists in the records, in the histories, in the occasional retelling of stories like this one. It persists in the knowledge that war, for all its technological and doctrinal evolution, remains fundamentally unchanged in its essential character. Men fight. Men die. Some deaths are remembered. Most are not. The reasons for the fighting are debated by historians and politicians. The men who do the fighting rarely have the luxury of debate. They have orders, objectives, and the immediate problem of survival. Galt's legacy, if it can be called that, is both specific and general. Specifically, he contributed a tactical method that was adopted and refined by subsequent units. Generally, he represents a type of officer common in every military, the competent professional who does his job well and dies in the process. There are thousands of such men in every war, and their stories are largely identical. They differ in detail but not in essence. They serve. They lead. They make decisions that result in death. They are killed or they survive. The ones who are killed are commemorated or forgotten depending on the visibility of their final actions. What makes Galt's story worth remembering is not that it is unique, but that it is representative. It illustrates the fundamental dynamics of combat, the interplay of terrain, technology, and human decision that determines outcomes at the tactical level. It demonstrates that war rewards insight and punishes exposure. It shows that courage, while necessary, is not sufficient, and that the ability to think clearly under pressure is at least as important as the willingness to face danger. Most importantly, it reveals the gap between the language we use to describe war and the reality of what actually happens. We speak of battles and engagements, of objectives taken and enemies defeated. These are abstractions that allow us to discuss war without confronting its visceral nature. The reality is simpler and more brutal. War is men killing other men, usually at a distance, sometimes at close range, occasionally in circumstances where one side has an overwhelming advantage and the other has none. Hill 209 was one such circumstance. The Germans in the trench were not defeated in combat. They were executed by geometry and firepower. This is not an exaggeration. It is a description of what occurred. Galt's role in this execution was central. He identified the method, positioned the weapon, and fired the shots. He is therefore responsible for those deaths in a direct and immediate way. This responsibility is not a moral failing. It is the function of his role. Officers are responsible for the deaths they order or inflict. This is understood and accepted as part of the profession. What is less often acknowledged is the weight of that responsibility, the cumulative burden of decisions that result in the termination of other lives. Some officers carry this weight openly. Others suppress it. Galt left no record of how he processed it, if he processed it at all. We are left to infer from his actions, and his actions suggest a man who accepted the necessity of what he was doing and proceeded without hesitation. This acceptance is both admirable and troubling. It is admirable because it reflects a clarity of purpose and a commitment to mission that is essential in combat. It is troubling because it suggests a capacity to compartmentalize the human cost of that mission, to see enemy soldiers as problems to be solved rather than as individuals with lives and families and a subjective experience of their own mortality. This compartmentalization is necessary for effective military action. It is also dehumanizing, and the fact that it is necessary does not make it less so. The men in the trench experienced their deaths as individuals. Each man had a final moment, a final thought, a final awareness of what was happening. Those moments are lost. We have no record of them. We do not know if they understood what was happening or if death came too quickly for understanding. We do not know if they felt fear or anger or resignation. These details are erased by the violence that ended their lives. What remains is the aggregate, the number 40, a figure that summarizes their deaths without describing them. This erasure is typical of military history, which deals in numbers and outcomes rather than individual experience. It is also necessary. The full accounting of every death in every action would be unbearable and useless. We simplify because we must, but the simplification has consequences. It allows us to discuss actions like Hill 209 in terms of tactics and heroism without fully confronting what those terms mean in practice. Tactics are methods for killing more efficiently. Heroism is the willingness to risk death in the execution of those methods. Both are essential to military effectiveness. Neither is morally simple. Galt understood this, or at least he acted in ways consistent with such understanding. He did not glorify what he was doing. He did not, as far as we know, express satisfaction or triumph at the outcome. He completed the mission, remained in position, and died when the Germans responded. His death suggests he understood that the action he had taken would provoke retaliation and that remaining exposed was dangerous. He did so anyway, for reasons we can speculate about but cannot confirm. Perhaps he felt obligated to see the action through to completion. Perhaps he underestimated the German response time. Perhaps he simply accepted that his death was likely and decided it was an acceptable cost. The last possibility is the most consistent with the archetype of the self-sacrificing officer, the leader who places the mission and the welfare of his men above his own survival. This archetype is celebrated in military culture, and Galt's posthumous recognition reflects that celebration. But the archetype obscures as much as it reveals. Self-sacrifice in war is often less a conscious choice than a product of circumstance. Men find themselves in situations where survival is unlikely, and they proceed because retreat is impossible or because the immediate demands of the situation override considerations of personal safety. Galt may have chosen to remain in the turret, but that choice was constrained by the tactical context, the expectations of his role, and the momentum of events. To describe it as purely voluntary is to simplify a complex decision made under conditions of extreme stress. What we are left with, finally, is a story that resists easy interpretation. Galt was brave. He was also violent. He saved lives. He also took them. He was honored. He was also killed. These contradictions are inherent to war, which creates situations where virtue and horror coexist, where the same action can be simultaneously necessary and tragic. Hill 209 is one example among thousands, notable primarily because it was documented and because the outcome was stark enough to demand attention. The soldiers who survived that day carried the memory with them. Some spoke of it later in interviews or memoirs. Most did not. War memories are often suppressed, not because they are forgotten but because they are too vivid, too laden with associations that disrupt ordinary life. The men who watched Galt fire into the trench, who saw the effect of that fire, who then saw him killed, were left with an image that no amount of time fully erases. They learned something that day about the nature of war, something that cannot be taught in training or conveyed in doctrine. They learned that war is not primarily about courage or strategy or national interest. It is about the application of violence to human bodies, and the side that applies that violence more effectively wins. This is a brutal lesson, and it is rarely stated so plainly. We prefer narratives that emphasize the nobility of sacrifice, the justice of the cause, the skill and bravery of the participants. These narratives are not false. They are incomplete. The complete story of Hill 209 includes all of these elements, but it also includes the image of 40 men dying in a trench with no chance of escape, killed by a weapon fired from a position they could not counter. That image is as much a part of the story as Galt's bravery, and to omit it is to misrepresent what happened. War is full of such omissions. We remember the victories and forget the methods. We honor the dead and ignore the manner of their dying. We construct narratives that make sense of chaos, that impose meaning on events that had no meaning beyond the immediate tactical objective. Hill 209 had no strategic significance. It did not change the outcome of the campaign or the war. It was a small action in a long series of small actions, each one costly, each one necessary only in the sense that it was ordered and therefore had to be done. Galt's death changed nothing except the lives of those who knew him. The Germans who died in the trench are forgotten except as a statistic in a battle report. This is the ordinary fate of most men who die in war. They become numbers aggregated and filed away, their individual stories lost to time. But numbers represent people. 40 men is 40 separate lives, 40 sets of experiences and relationships and hopes that ended in 90 seconds on a hillside in Italy. The fact that we do not know their names or their stories does not make them less real. It makes them invisible, and that invisibility is part of the structure of war. We cannot fight wars if we insist on seeing the enemy as fully human. We cannot sustain the violence required if we acknowledge the individuality of every person we kill. So we create distance, linguistic and psychological, that allows us to do what war requires. We speak of objectives and targets and enemy forces. We do not speak of men dying in trenches. Galt spoke of none of this. He executed the mission and died. The rest is interpretation, the attempt by those who come after to make sense of actions that may not have required sense, only execution. We want the story to mean something, to offer a lesson or a moral that justifies the retelling. But perhaps the meaning is simply that war is what it is, and that no amount of courage or honor or tactical brilliance changes its essential nature.